Hi, my name is Cathy Collins, and I'll be co-hosting Airing Addiction with Lisa Blanchard.
No one story is the same as someone else's, but each journey is different.
Thing on the table.
Having run substance use treatment programs for over 20 years, trying to make sure that we are welcoming to all. I love the idea that kind of having that exposure and that affirming place, even for one person, impacts that milieu, which then can impact maybe the broader recovery community, the community at large. I mean, I really love that thought.
Everyone. My name is Cathy Collins, and welcome to another episode of our Airing Addiction podcast. We have a couple of amazing guests today, and I'm going to turn it over to my host, who will introduce them, my co-host, Lisa Blanchard.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. I'm really, really excited about this episode. And for the first time in a while with Airing Addiction, we actually have more than one guest. And so we're really excited to have you both here together. So with us today, we have Sarah Cloud, who's the Director of Social Work at Beth Israel Deaconess. And she's really here to talk about a children's book that she wrote that I think everybody will be really excited to hear about, Mama Paca. And Theresa, Harmon is the founder of To the Moon and Back, which is an organization dedicated to helping children born with in utero substance exposure. And so I'm really, really excited to have you both here and have you both kind of sharing the really exciting work that you've been doing, supporting kids and families. And maybe Sarah, if you want to start, but can you just tell us a little bit about the work that you do and kind of how that led you to writing the book that, Cathy's showing us now?
Yes, good morning. Thank you so much for having me, and it's such an important conversation to be having. So as my role in the hospital setting, I've been on the front lines of the opiate epidemic for many years. In addition to the work I do in the hospital, I also am really drawn to do a lot of community work. And through that community work, I think I've really met a lot of families who have lost loved ones in the epidemic, and they really have gone above and beyond to do some really amazing things. People that particularly have inspired me is Mary Peckham. So Mary Peckham lost her son Matthew about 5-6 years ago to the opiate epidemic, and she makes these beautiful memory bears. And so when I was really thinking about and looking for children's literature, particularly for the elementary school age, the young children, I really couldn't find anything that talked about addiction, but certainly none that talked about grief as it relates to addiction. And my thought process of starting this journey started about 2 years ago when I was sitting around the table at a task force meeting waiting for it to begin with Joanne Peterson. And I was asking Joanne Peterson, are you aware of any literature in this area? And she didn't. And so, fast forward a couple of years, I decided to go ahead and try to fill that void myself, and was really also inspired by another local writer by the name of Laura Washington. And she wrote A Sickness You Can't See. And it's a really great book, I think, about explaining what the disease of addiction is to children. It doesn't go into the grief and loss associated with it. And so that, inspired me that I could do this myself and self-publish. And so Mama Paca, My Heart Won't Let You Go, came about. And it is actually one of a 4-part series. And it is about a little girl who lost her mom to the disease of addiction and how she copes, works with her loved ones, her grandparents, how she's in therapy, and really wanted to normalize all that experiences. And she's comforted by an alpaca, a stuffed alpaca. This is Mama Paca, made by Mary Peckham, who was making the memory bears. I went back to her and said, hey, can you make me an alpaca? So she joined forces with me, and the alpaca, Mama Paca, is made of the clothing, the saddle and the legs of the mom's shirt. So it is a comfort animal. So it's a comfort animal and can accompany the book, or certainly the book can stand on its own as well. And so we launched that a couple of months ago. and are in the process of writing a second book. It's called Paca, the Kind-Hearted Warrior. So we have teamed up in the process of writing the second book with the family of Sean Staunton. So Sean Staunton was a leader and beloved Boston Bulldog Running Club member. And almost 4 years into recovery, he had a reoccurrence this past June and died. And so Papa Paca is telling his story and his journey both into addiction and everything he accomplished in his life. And so it's really also a celebration of his life, as well as trying to help his young son cope and come to grips with the loss. There are quite a few themes in the book and throughout these series that I think is really important to emphasize and to follow through. So I also have a website called mamapaca.com that outlines some guidance on how to introduce books, how to introduce the topic of addiction, how to set the stage for that, but also the themes throughout the series that would be helpful to reinforce as caregivers, as family members, as therapists, as anyone who's involved in working with children around the disease of addiction. And so, for example, some of the themes are: you're not alone, it's not your fault, you are loved. It's important to celebrate the the person that is lost, speak about them often. And to family members, it's really important to express emotion around children and for them to see that expression of emotion, and that they shouldn't be afraid to do that. So this just kind of highlights some of the themes that I've outlined both in this series as well as on our website.
And those are to come, the future of the series.
Yes, two. So Mama Paca's a little girl and her mom. Papa Paca's Kind-Hearted Warrior is a little boy and his dad. And then there'll be the combination of a little girl and her dad and a little boy and his mom.
It's such a wonderful book. Before we jump into Theresa's story, but I was thinking when I read it, how it's not morose at all. It's uplifting, which I thought was amazing because I didn't know what to expect from it. I mean, I do know a lot of children have lost their parents. It's just such a tragic thing. And so the story behind it was uplifting and celebratory, and that it gives me chills to even think of it. And I do love the idea of the memory animal because it gives you something to hold on to. I think it is such a touching book. I love it. I
am particularly in awe of my illustrator. She does such a beautiful job, both with color and animation, and really bringing the story to life. And the expressions she gives this little girl is priceless.
It's heartwarming. It really is. I agree. Yeah.
So, and one of the really important pieces to me, and I think this is probably towards the hope that you're referring to, is that we often talk about how somebody courageously battles with the disease of cancer or, some other medical disease, but we rarely, I think, historically have seen that in the disease of addiction. And that's absolutely one of the themes, and that is clearly outlined in the book. The grandparents tell the little girl how proud they were of their mom, how brave she was when she was the sickest, and how hard she fought.
Right.
And that's what, the theme that I think I really I'm grabbing on to is really combating that shame and guilt that kind of comes along. So, and the stigma that just is so inherent in the way that, people talk about addiction, and kids can absorb that too, right? They can absorb how people are talking about their loved one, their mom, their dad, and then internalize that and have some shame and guilt. And this just is so much more positive, right? It's celebrating the courageous battle, right? It's celebrating, and when you speak of Sean's story in your upcoming book, it sounds like you're going to talk a lot about his recovery story, right? And all the work that he did in recovery, and how much and how important that is, and how proud, his son should be of that work.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And there are so many pathways to addiction. I don't want to stereotype. So in this first book, Mama Paca, The mom's in a car accident, she's prescribed pain medications. That was her pathway in. Sean's story is different. And, he was kind of self-medicating, and, full of energy. And I think, using substances kind of helps slow down his busy mind and help center him. And I think they're all very important stories to be told. There's not any one way in and there's not any one way out. So just really be able to celebrate the individual folks that are struggling with the disease of addiction and support their families as well.
Mm-hmm.
I love that sentence. I'm totally going to use that from here on out. Like, right, there's not one way in or one way out, because it really celebrates how individual everybody's path is and how individual their recovery path is, and kind of supports, all pathways to recovery. So I love that.
And I talk a lot on my website about using age-appropriate language and how important that is. But I also want to note that I take on a couple of pretty big words and pretty big concepts in this series. And my hope is to do one or two per book. But I think it's really important to set the stage and help reduce the stigma by talking about the disease of addiction as we would talk about in medical terms, as we would talk about other diseases. And so trying to put a little bit of that out in each time. And I know that it's far beyond, I think, a reoccurrence, and what that is. It goes kind of far beyond elementary school age, but I think setting that tone and that language and giving common ground, so that as the child develops, their brains develop, their concept of a disease of addiction develops, that they can keep coming back to that and build on that foundation.
I think that's terrific. So it sounds like an amazing resource that we can actually turn families to as well. So you said it's mamapaca.com is the website?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And just to note, we will add all of these resources in footnotes to this podcast when we publish it out there, because these are such great resources that you're giving us. It's such an untapped, I think, area, like you said, which is an amazing reason why you wrote the book. And things that you touched on before we get to Theresa's side of the story is the Boston Bulldogs running company. Yeah, that's another great resource for healthy, holistic treatment, sort of to add that to your recovery story. So that's another thing we'll list, but that in and of itself is a whole group of people who are fighting addiction and helping each other through a healthy way.
Yep. And you do not need to be a runner or a marathon runner or anything to join. There are plenty of walkers like myself, and it's really for families as well. It's anyone that's been touched by addiction, and treatment providers. So it's really just a very welcoming community.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah, I always say you're a runner if you say you are, even if you walk most of the time.
I'm a wannabe.
Very similar to you say you are, right? It's all pathways to running, whether it's walking or not. So just to hear a little bit from Theresa, would you mind sharing a little bit about kind of To the Moon and Back and kind of your story and how you started doing this work supporting children?
Yeah, absolutely. So like Sarah, who is an amazing friend and mentor to me, and I'm, just so blessed to watch all the wonderful work she does. So kudos to her. I'm a clinical social worker. I work for Brigham and Women's full time. And I had background in early childhood education, early intervention. I worked for the Department of Children and Families down in Florida. And so, I had a pretty solid understanding of early childhood development and things like that. And so back in 2013, my husband and I adopted our first child, who was born opiate dependent. We got him, straight from the hospital. And so, we came home with him, and they kind of just, told us like, good luck in life, do the best that you can. And, I was kind of prepared for what we were going to encounter, as he withdrew from opiates, for his first several months of life. But there wasn't a lot of research. There wasn't a lot of support out there, as he got older, when we were still seeing some differences in his development, mostly around sensory processing, executive functioning. And so, we decided that, other families, if I had this background, and I was struggling, that there must be other families out there that were struggling as well. So we started initially with a support group meeting at the Plymouth Recovery Center. And we started to get to know families, and we started to talk about what we were seeing, and we were all kind of seeing the same things in our children. And so from there, working with these families, we have now about 150 families that we're involved with here in Massachusetts, and about 125 families down in West Virginia, where we also have a chapter. Because, as you know, West Virginia has been particularly hard hit by the opioid crisis. And we were just really fortunate to hook up with a really great team down there that were able to continue our work. So with these families' input, we started to develop additional services for families and children to support them. So that's kind of how we got our start. So we started the nonprofit in 2017. So we've had, about 3 years now. To my knowledge, there's no one else in Massachusetts that is doing this particular work. We get contacted from around the country for families looking for answers, because we're just, we don't know what the long-term outcomes are just yet.
And it's tothemoonandback.org.
It's the number 2, themoonandback.org. Yeah.
And that's so wonderful. And it's, and tell me if I'm accurate, but you probably have a mix of families, right? So you probably have, folks like in your position, either, have adopted or have taken care of, family members, children, but you also may have some parents in recovery, right, who are now parenting, because they're now in recovery and they're able to unify and parent their children. So you probably are, also supporting folks that are in recovery, kind of also do some of this, challenging work of parenting in general, but also when you're seeing kind of some of these, similar behaviors, across the children.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a little bit of everybody. We actually, on our website, we have a really great video series from the perspective of a mom in recovery, a grandparent raising a grandchild, a foster adoptive parent, just talking about what it's been like raising a child born with neonatal abstinence syndrome. One of my favorite projects that we've done. But yeah.
It's interesting to me. I guess the first thing that came to mind is you went home with your baby from the hospital straight away. And then it takes I didn't realize, but it took a long time for the withdrawal process to happen. Were you equipped with anything to or was it like, here you go, good luck? I mean, to me, that's a little scary.
Yeah, so it was. And granted, so we adopted my son out of Florida. Here in Massachusetts, over the last several years, they've formed a really great collaborative through the Perinatal Quality Improvement Network, where they really try to keep family dyads together. They try to keep mom and baby together as much as they can, but they do a lot of work around decreasing additional opiate exposure, because we wean these babies off with additional opiates, and trying to steer clear of giving them meds that they maybe don't need. And so, one of the other projects that we worked on was we have these take-home boxes that many of the hospitals in Massachusetts distribute, like Boston Medical Center, South Shore Hospital, BI in Plymouth, Mass General. So when a baby is born with NAS, they go home with this box of essentials that our families have kind of curated with items that they think are really helpful. So a particular swaddle to help with the sensory process, Dr. Brown's bottles, which our families find are really helpful. What else is in there? Kids are born with hypertonia, which is a fancy word for just tight muscles And so getting them to kind of move their hands to midline is really important. So we have different toys in there to help promote that. Certain pacifiers that families, think are really helpful as kids go through withdrawal.
So he is 7 today.
Yeah, so I have a 7-year-old, and we just adopted our second, who is 2, who is also born opiate dependent. And it's interesting to see because their presentation is very different. My son was very sensory involved, and my younger has some sensory stuff too, but is a bit more medical. So
it's 2 boys.
yep, 2 boys.
Beautiful.
Congratulations. That's wonderful.
And so one of the things, having worked in opiate treatment for many, many years now at Spectrum, is there doesn't seem to be a lot of information about which babies are going to have more difficulty, after they're born, and which won't. Like, it does, we always kind of share this with moms on medications for opiate use disorder. It's not necessarily related to what your dose was or what it's just, it's very variable on the impact, and there's not a lot of research. And it also sounds like there's just not a lot of, you're kind of trying to fill that gap qualitatively, right? There's not a lot of research for what behaviors we then see, for neonatal abstinence syndrome as children age. I mean, is there any movement that you're aware of to try to actually do some research and studies that will help, long term for kids?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so that's kind of 2 questions, when mom is pregnant, what is the best medication? And then afterwards, what is the best if, babies need to be weaned with medication, what's best? And there's a lot of studies looking at both. Dr. Alicia Watchman up at Boston Medical Center, they're on the cutting edge of everything. And they work closely with Yale New Haven on a lot of this research. So for when moms are still pregnant, there's a lot of factors to control for, like what you said, timing of exposure, length of exposure, the medication. From what I hear from doctors is that it's really hard to control for all of those factors. And so we may never know, exactly, but they are definitely doing the work. Dr. Watchman is actually doing a study, and there hasn't been a lot of new information that's come out from it since last August, but she's looking at Vivitrol, because, Vivitrol being an antagonist, babies that aren't born with NAS, and that's been shown to be pretty promising in a small study that she had done. And then, there's been some studies that have shown that Suboxone versus methadone may be better. Tufts is looking at, because there's a small amount of alcohol in methadone, they've looked at their own formulation of methadone where they've removed the alcohol content, which has shown some more improved outcomes as well. So yeah, there's a lot of different things. There's an NIH study that's being performed currently. I think the results of it in relation to outcomes for kids will be released in 2021, and they looked at kids over 5 years. So that will be really interesting. Sorry, I think I just geeked out on you on all the research.
Listen, that's why I asked the question, right? This is the stuff I want to hear about, and and certainly is really important to my work, because I've been working with pregnant moms, for decades now, and one of the biggest things that I always tell pregnant moms too is that whatever is going to support you in your recovery and help you the most is what is going to help your child the most, right? So if a medication isn't working for you, or you continue to have a cycle of use and withdrawal, that's going to be a bigger impact, right? Than whatever choice you make for medication or your recovery pathway. So whatever is going to support you, and wrap around you as much as possible is kind of the option to choose, for sure.
Absolutely. And one of these things that you hear, when you go to the Perinatal Quality Improvement Network meetings is that, if we're doing this right, if we're supporting moms in recovery, kids are going to get, they're going to be born opiate dependent. And so, from there, we just need to figure out how to get them early services and to get them what they need. Because, like I have a 7-year-old who, he has some services, but he's really doing wonderful. And these kids aren't, they're not affected like they are with alcohol, with alcohol spectrum disorders. They're very, very intelligent. And so, sorry, I get a little emotional when I talk about my kids. They're incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's stigma associated, right? Because people think of substance use, they think, there's probably even stigma, on children, which is terrible, and that it's not necessarily the same impact as significant exposure to alcohol, and that these kids are very intelligent, and having to kind of combat that and show kind of what wonderful kids they are.
Right. And that has been one of the really great things about the book that we had put out, Sam the Superhero and a Super Life. It is an opportunity to have a conversation with these kids about their birth history. Because I can say, like, as a parent, I was like, how do you present this to them? In my mind, it was going to be like when he gets into middle school, and I was worried that, maybe he would get into drugs, and letting him know, that he has this parental history so that he's careful. But this, the book, which is for elementary school age kids, and it's from the point of view of a little boy who's born with neonatal abstinence syndrome. It talks about some of the long-term impact that he has experienced and how that affects him socially. Um, by mistake the other day, because I wasn't really ready to have this conversation with my son. He had watched a video. We have Meg Donnelly, who's an actress. She's Addison on Zombies. She's an American Housewife as well. She's doing a reading. It's actually posting today of our book to help raise awareness around NAS. So he saw that, and he had a lot of questions, and it was really great. It was a really great catalyst to be able to talk about his birth history. And, he's 7. So, he obviously, we talked about it in to his age level, but it was a positive experience.
And is he aware that his brother also, I mean, did that come up at all? So he can just be extra loving. I mean, I think you and your husband are amazing. And as a family, my heart is like so happy for you, because you have an opportunity. Not only are you just a parent in general, but you're making a difference in the world. And I think that's a beautiful thing, with being able to share the information. Collectively, the information that the two of you have is remarkable, almost like you should go on tour, because the world needs you out there. There's so much. I mean, you mentioned Virginia or West Virginia, and I think Ohio, Southern Ohio, Kentucky. I mean, literally, if you had the means, I would imagine there could be a chapter everywhere in every state based on what's happening in the world right now.
Absolutely. And, at this point, because of obviously, like any nonprofit, financial constraints, what we try to do is lend our support in any way that we can. We want to encourage families that want to advocate in their state to be able to do something like what we did, or even, to partner with us and be under, our heading, however they want to do it. We just want to support them.
And so one of the things that I'm so struck by, and I'm so glad to have you both on this podcast at the same time, and it also reminds me of a couple other folks we've had on. We've had Maureen Cavanaugh and Joanne Peterson on, that you encounter, either it's through your work or your personal life or some combination thereof, a need, right? A hole. You go to look for resources, support, help, and you don't find it. And so instead of being frustrated at the fact that you don't find it, you actually do something about it, right? Like you fill that gap yourself, which is absolutely amazing, and is exactly kind of what needs to get out there. Is that if you see something that is a need, you can self-publish a book, right? You can start an organization, So, is there anything else that you both of you or either of you want to say about kind of what prompted you to take that next step, right, to actually kind of solve a challenge or help or support yourself?
Sarah?
I think that while I stepped up to maybe write this book series, it was really through a significant amount of collaboration and inspiration. I'm very, very grateful to team up with, on the webpage, it's Meet the Warriors of Hope. So it's, Mary Peckham tells her story. Kat, the illustrators in long-term recovery, she talks about her story and how, illustrating this book or just art in general really is part of her healing and part of her recovery. And, and I think being inspired by Theresa and her husband, in their journey, I think it all comes full circle. We're all working towards the same goal, to help, and to kind of we all step up in our own ways and feel inspired, and that work comes out through that. So I feel very fortunate.
I would agree with Sarah. I mean, I think, especially here in Plymouth County, we're so fortunate to have such a great collaboration. So, when I started this nonprofit, I was met with open arms by, everyone in this community. So it just makes doing this work, so great to have all these collaborative partners that are able to help us. And it's just, as a social worker, it's what social workers do. You fill the need. If you see something that's not there, you create it. But that's not only for social workers, that's really for anybody.
And so one of the things that strikes me too, especially right now, right? Like we're all living through a really challenging time, really isolating time. And do you have it like, so any kind of support, whether that's through, children's books, which kind of you both have been a part of, kind of support, all of the resources that you can provide, that's something that's really helping to combat the isolation that we're all feeling right now, where right now we're meeting virtually. I'd love to be sitting in a conference room doing this podcast with you all, but that's just not what we do now, right? So how else can we support kids and support families who are taking care of kids, especially during the pandemic?
That is a really great question, and not an easy one. And my daughters are 18 years of age and older, and I'm in some regards I feel a little fortunate because I have tremendous respect for the balancing act that families are doing right now, in terms of homeschooling and managing everything they have going on in their life. And so I think trying to stay present in the moment, and also just take small accomplishments, which we historically would have maybe thought of as small accomplishments, as just getting through the day is a big accomplishment right now. And I think the more we can share resources and information, I think not only is there not a lot of these books out there, particularly for the elementary school age, they're hard to come by. So one of the pages on the website is linking and listing all of these groups: SAM, the superhero, Sickness You Can't See, Hey Kiddo, I think is a little bit better known for a little bit older, teens. So, as I travel and engage with more folks and learn of any other additional books, I'd really like to link those on there so that they can you can spend more time, reading or being with the child, and less time trying to search for these resources. You really shouldn't.
Right. Have them in one spot. Like even some of the Sesame Street's done some nice work.
Yes.
Around this. Yeah.
And I think one of the blessings of the pandemic, or the silver lining, if I could say there is one, is how much has gone virtual. So I think, like Theresa, I don't know if you want to talk to your support groups held at the Plymouth Recovery Center, since they've gone virtual, really opened up the geographics of people who could participate in this, and maybe made it a little bit easier because you didn't have to find childcare as much and commute, that you could just sit in your living room and turn on the video camera and engage that way. So I think it provides casts a larger net geographically of people who can kind of participate where maybe it was a little bit more challenging before.
Theresa, would you agree to that your audience has way expanded since?
Yeah, absolutely. So, when we were meeting at the Plymouth Recovery Center in person, a big piece of this is that, you're asking parents to take an hour out of their night that are, may have multiple children with some special needs. And that's a big ask. So our groups were always kind of like poorly attended in person. And we already had a plan before COVID started to switch to a Zoom format so we could reach the entire state versus just the area. And I would say like the very first night that we started meeting, we had like 20 people, right off the bat. And that's kind of continued that we've been able to connect with more people. It's also allowed us to connect with people outside the state, which has been really great. It has affected our ability. We do kids groups. We haven't, been able to meet in person for that, but we have done some, the drive-through events to still maintain that social interaction for the kids. Educationally, I think been a challenge for our kids. A lot of our kids are on IEPs. And so, we've really beefed up we have an educational advocate. So we, have her available if IEPs aren't being followed or if kids need some additional services while they're doing, remote learning or hybrid learning. And then we also have a children's grant, which I think during COVID has been used a bit more. So it's pretty open-ended. It's for any expenses related to a substance exposure diagnosis. So we've seen like an uptick in families that need it for some additional sensory stuff at home to help with calming, computers and things like that to help with learning. So we've been able to try to change our services around a little bit to help.
And so I wonder if it's similar to kind of what the experiences in the substance use treatment world of shifting to telehealth, right? So you're removing those barriers of travel, of childcare, all of those things. But there's also a piece of providing support in somebody's environment, right? That you're actually kind of talking about coping skills when they're actually in their environment, not like in an office coming to a therapy session. And so I wonder if there's some positive impact instead of like, you talk about like having an evening group, for example. That's a really challenging time for any parent with kids of most ages, let alone if there's any special needs, right? That kind of meltdown evening time, dinner time, bath, bed, that time frame, and trying to get out of the house during that time must be challenging. But then if you could have actual virtual support really when that's stressful for you as it is, I wonder if that's had a positive impact.
Yeah, it's actually really sweet. Like we'll get on to our support group calls and we have, parents pushing their kids and like they're swaying, the kids are like bouncing on the trampoline while we're talking. So it's really cool to see, it's, you found your people.
Well, I love what I hear both of you saying about, I'm a woman in recovery and I go both ways with Zoom being a really great thing and being a really enough already as we all sit here on Zoom. But I think you both present so well the positive value of having the connection via Zoom that there's so much more. You can reach more people. You can do exactly what you just said, where the family engagement can be different. And I think personally, I find it fascinating that you were planning it prior to COVID, because it's like, who would have ever thought where we would end up? But what a great thing, because it doesn't need to end. People can go back to face-to-face recovery meetings, but I think there will always be a place now for Zoom connections in every regard, because what we're doing is really opening up our world in a way we never knew we could.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So is there anything else that you kind of haven't shared that you think would be important for folks that are listening to this podcast to hear? And anything that we kind of didn't ask enough about or touch on?
I know, if I might, Theresa briefly mentioned the video series that's on To the Moon and Back's website. I think that is probably, aside from the book, because the book is Sam, this superhero, is very, very uplifting and very sweet and hopeful. But the video series for adults to look at and see and hear that wide range of experience, I will have to tell you, absolutely need some tissues. I don't care who you are, it is going to elicit a lot of emotion. Those are really our superheroes, the folks that are really taking care of and nurturing our children who have been born exposed. So I'd highly, highly recommend, taking a look at that if anyone hasn't done that yet.
those are all on the organization website.
Yeah, to the moon and back.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd also really encourage people who are on social media to follow both To the Moon and Back and to Mama Paca's children's series. There's a lot of information that gets pushed out, both announcements, education, resources. So I think those are really good. If you're on social media, to really to utilize those links as well.
And fill our social media with kind of positive support right
Yes.
now. I think we could all use a little more of that for sure.
Yes. A little less politics, a little bit more hope.
Absolutely.
And what typically Lisa and I like to end our podcast by asking our guests it could be this, but what our favorite books are, or books, not necessarily even a resource, a book or a podcast that is inspiring or inspirational to each of you on a personal level or a business level, however you would like to categorize it. But we kind of like to dive into your head and see what you find inspirational as people.
You want me to go, Sarah?
If you would.
So obviously these books that we've already talked about, but for me as, a therapist, one of the books that I think has the most impact and for many of my patients is Dr. Van der Kolk's book on trauma, which of course I can't think of the name of it right now.
The Body Keeps the Score.
The Body Keeps the Score. I think that that's a really important book on so many levels. So I think that would be my pick.
That's good.
Yeah. This is a really great question. I know I already talked a couple of times about A Sickness You Can't See, which I think is great and maybe underutilized. But I think professionally and personally, I know Dr. Brene Brown is very popular these days, but I think the one book that really was very helpful professionally and personally was Rising Strong, where she really talks a lot about being vulnerable, being present. And I think there's some really wonderful lessons and ways to connect both with others and with yourself through that book.
I love that book. That's wonderful. Lisa, you have any parting questions?
No, I mean, I was so happy to have you both here. I mean, it's, similar, but very kind of different, audiences, but really kind of that focus on supporting, not just children and families, but by doing so, supporting those in recovery, and really that all of that normalizes, the disease of addiction, right? And normalizes that recovery, that recovery story, and celebrates that recovery story, and that it's not all negativity, right? It's not all, the shame and guilt that everybody carries around and everybody carries on other people's behalf. And, and so that's one of the things that we really try to do in this podcast, is share these kind of positive stories that have a lot of hope. And I don't think we've ever had this podcast so far since Cathy and I have been running it where we have not said the word hope. And so, I was happy to hear it several times.
But I do feel hope in this. I feel hope in the book, and I feel hope in each of you. My heart feels really excited to have met you. We both kind of geek out when we meet authors and people. So I was totally, yay. And I didn't know your story, Theresa, but I had heard great things about you. So to hear your story just makes it that much even greater, I think. I mean, as human beings, it's inspiring to meet people who are making a difference in the world. And that's how I felt after talking to you guys today.
You are definitely partners in hope and warriors of hope. So we really appreciate everything you do to get this talking about the disease of addiction and getting these resources and information and hope out to everybody. So it's really wonderful.
We're going to push it out. Believe us, we push it out on all the social media and that. And we're grateful for all of the resources you mentioned. I was frantically taking notes so that we can make sure that we push all that out as well.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for all you do.
Yes.
Thanks for joining us.